Hello, wherever you're watching, and welcome to the Big Lit Festival. We're delighted to be a part of that. I'm Robyn Marsack, and I'm a trustee of the Edwin Morgan Trust. And we've been celebrating since April the 100th birthday of Edwin Morgan. And I'm, of course, delighted and privileged, as always, to be in conversation with Liz Lochhead, who needs really no introduction. But in case there are people watching who don't know about Liz, she is one of the great Scottish poets. And she was Makar, that is our national poet, after Edwin Morgan. She was a friend of Eddie's and knew him well. We all lived within streets of each other in Glasgow. And here we are, living or broadcasting to you from different streets, but in the same neighbourhood as Eddie lived in. Liz, you're going to begin, I think, with a slightly autumnal poem.
Yes, a little image. This poem is just called Aberdeen Train. Rubbing a glistening circle on the steamed up window, I framed a pheasant in a field of mist. The sun was a great red thing somewhere low, struggling with the milky scene. In the furrows, a piece of glass winked into life, hypnotized the silly dandy. We hooted past him with his head cocked, contemplating a bottle end. And this was the last of October, a Chinese moment in the Mearns.
That's kind of unexpected from him, isn't it? I'm really pleased that you chose that, because we don't really think of Eddie as a landscape poet.
No, not really. But he was all kinds of poets, that's the thing. There was absolutely no genre or no style of poetry that he didn't touch. I mean, I think people often really, over-credit poets with being mono-voiced. You know, you go for Ted Hughes because of the brute force of the poems and we expect them to be like that. But actually, whereas painters like Picasso was completely lauded for his, different styles all the time and changing, it's not regarded as, it's not taken as seriously in poets for some reason. It's wrong, I think, but it isn't.
And speaking directly there of painters, I think the second poem you're going to read is about a painter. And I think that Eddie's interest in the visual arts was very acute. And I wondered whether you ever talked about painting with him. Since you are quite...
Yes, he was very, very keen on Japanese prints. I mean, there's a terrific poem that mentions Untamaro, so that I never see that famous Japanese print with the what's the big mountain and the wave coming.
Fuji and the waves.
Yes, exactly. That's now because of the conversations with Eddie, and there's a poem that also uses that. I never see it without thinking of Eddie as well as Untamaro. So there we go. But this is a painter much nearer the ground. And he did tell me about this painter. He tells me that one day that in Edinburgh, at the Edinburgh Festival, and it must have been just after she was made to an RSA, just a year, which was not long before her death. She died very, very young, at the age of about 42. So she might already, although she didn't know it, be already ill with breast cancer, but she definitely was made an RSA on the same day as a friend of mine's dad, Alberto Morocco and her were made RSAs on the same day. And I've seen a photograph of the two of them together. But Eddie says that he passed by Joan Yeardley, and she was a big woman sitting on the steps of the gallery, and he recognised who she was. And I said, "Oh, did you go and talk to her?" And he said, "No, I was too shy." So it's just so sad, isn't it, that these two wonderful artists, two different, as it happens, gay artists, and also very shy people, didn't meet each other, although probably she might have looked up and thought, there's Edwin Morgan. For all we know, it would be nice to be able to ask. But this is to Joan Yeardley, and he owned this painting. I saw this painting. It was in his house not far from me, along, the flat that he lived in for all the years from the age of 40 onwards. His very modernist flat along near Annie's Land. So this particular Morgan painting, this particular John Eardley painting was in Morgan's wall, and it was little. It was just a little painting, and I can picture that as well. So this is to John Eardley. Pale yellow letters humbly straggling across the once brilliant red of a broken shop face. Confectio, and a blur of children at their games passing, gazing as they pass at the blur of sweets in the dingy, cosy, rotten row window, and Eardley on my wall. Such rags and streaks that master us, that fix what the pick and bulldozer have crumbled to a dingier dust. The living blur, fiercely guarding energy that has vanished, cries filling still the unechoing close. I wandered by the rubble, and the houses left standing kept a chill, dying life in their islands of stone. No window opened as the coal cart rolled, and the coalman's call fell coldly to the ground. But the shrill children jump on my wall.
I love those shrill children, and
Yes.
the confectio, the word not
Yes.
quite finished on the wall. That's
It's
also
like a Latin. It's like a Latin.
Yes.
I will. Latin conditional. I will make.
Yes.
But it's obviously it's a
Absolutely.
confectioner's shop where they've gone confectio, a blur of children. I love the lines. Such rags and streaks that master us. And it absolutely captures her impasto style, so very different from the precision of the Chinese print in the last poem. So 2 poems to start with that are just little imagist poems, but both based on describing something visual accurately, and with a lot of assonance and consonants in the words. It's difficult to say them correctly, and good fun too. So really the energy in the poem comes out of the language that he's chosen to make these visual things absolutely precise. You can see them over again.
So it's an exercise of observation, but also an exercise in sound, and they're inextricable in that way. And I love the Eardley too, because it takes us back to that whole sense of what was happening in the 50s and 60s, well, the 60s especially in Glasgow, with things being torn down, especially around the barrows in that area, and what was gained and what was lost. And I think that Eddie was not a man who dwelt on loss so much as on gain. He was a very forward, future-looking person, and so that's the energy of the poems, or the one you're going to read now. But the energy of the poems often come from this forward motion.
Always. He did record what was passing with joy. That Eardley, there it is, and he got it down there. But he wasn't sentimental about the past. He never was nostalgic for the past. This poem is it's very conceited in a programme that's about Edwin Morgan, to be reading a couple of poems of mine, but they're poems about Eddie, and so they're part of the conversation. So it's probably my only chance to get to read these poems. But this one is one that I know you like, Robyn, and that was a kind of present to me when we were talking about what to put in. That you liked this poem so much, and I remember I liked the event that the poem describes, and I was almost, when I read the poem to myself, I'm almost parodying Eddie's method in this particular poem. It's called Almost Christmas at the Writer's House. And this was when we had been, it was a little group of Scottish poets just after the wall came down. I think it was in 1990. It was to do with the City of Culture. Some of us Glaswegian poets were there in a place called the Literarisch Colloquium. It was a sort of writer's house in Berlin, near a sort of suburban area of Berlin called Wannsee, which had a big loch at it. But it was a wonderful little modern house. And we were there just before Christmas. You know, we were flying back just a week before Christmas, I remember. And so the poem's called, and the poem speaks for itself really, Almost Christmas at the Writer's House. Morgan, master of the instamatic poem, has flung open the glass door 3 stories up of this high guest suite, and his own camera, cocked and ready, flash gun primed, is muttering, Marguerite, Marguerite, with a mock bar and much glee, about to freeze frame the scene before him. Untouched by even a spring of bird claw, perfect behind wrought iron battlements, 20 or 30 feet of snowy roof drop sports a chair and round terrazzo table, tipsily iced with an inches deep drift. Directly opposite, behind another rooftop door, which mirrors this, lit up by slicing beams of Anglepoise, but quite empty this late at night, is the beautiful Bauhaus camp of the office of the director of the Literarische Colloquium. Behind Morgan, Withers, Mulrine, McNaughton, Lochhead, well-clad, scarved and booted, stamp and laugh, impatient for goulash soup and Berliner Weisse at the restaurant by Wannsee S. Bahnhof. Then breathe, stilled as his shutter falls, stopped by this one moment's crystalline, unbroken vision of the dreaming order in the purring electric heart of the house of our hosts. And it's very much done in the instamatic style, but we're going to talk about that now. Eddie in the 70s, I think it was, starting from the 70s, wrote a whole book of poems that were instamatic poems. They were always in the present tense, and they described a scene like it was a photograph, but of course it was not things that you necessarily would have been able to photograph. So, instamatic poem. So yes, I realised that I was deliberately using exactly the style that Eddie wrote, because these poems would be written in the present tense. They would snapshot a moment. And of course, if you think about them, they're pictures. I stupidly at first thought, these are amazing photographs. And then I realised that of course they weren't true. So this is called Glasgow, 5th of March, 1971. So that's what he deliberately, you know, dated them all kind of, and they were called instamatic poems. There were a lot of them. This is probably one of the most memorable of them. Glasgow, 5th of March, 1971. With a ragged diamond of shattered plate glass, a young man and his girl are falling backwards into a shop window. The young man's face is bristling with fragments of glass, and the girl's leg has caught on the broken window and spurts arterial blood over her wet-look white coat. Their arms are starfished out, braced for impact. Their faces show surprise, shock, and the beginning of pain. The 2 youths who have pushed them are about to complete the operation, reaching into the window to loot what they can smartly. Their faces show no expression. It is a sharp, clear night in Sauchiehall Street. In the background, 2 drivers keep their eyes on the road.
It's a fabulous poem, and for lots of reasons. And I think partly those dates reflect where he might have picked up his inspiration in newspapers, because especially when he's referring to
Yep.
events that happen abroad. That's probably where he got the germ of the poem. But I think this poem is cinematic, isn't it, in its
Yes.
violence and in its
Well, it's a
arrest.
freeze frame. If it's
Yes.
cinematic, it's a freeze frame because they're about to do this thing. You know, it's about the present moment that these things do. He absolutely captures the shutters click in these
Yes.
poems, you know. So I realised how closely I was parodying them, kind of deliberately, you know, and affectionately and enviously. I was, you know, following all these things. But you were talking about how he definitely, in the 60s, at the time of Yeardley and you know, Rotten Row getting pulled to bits and Glasgow rising, you know, he was not somebody who disparaged in advance high-rise buildings or anything like that. You know, he was an optimist about modernism, modern architecture, modern things. He left, you know, I think he was able to criticise them later on when they got into the present tense and he disapproved of them. But he wasn't sentimental about that either. He wasn't sentimental about anything. I think he really enjoyed more than anything else to be clear-eyed about things. But there was a particular time when Eddie came absolutely into the ken of my close friends. I mean, my friends and contemporaries here in Glasgow, well, Alistair Gray was 10 years older than me, but he was, you know, just beginning to, you know, Lanark had come out. Jim Kelman, who's almost exactly the same age as me, had just written his first great stories and been championed, as I was, by Philip Hobsbawm, you know, here in Glasgow. There was never a writers' group, but, you know, all of us used to, you know, individually, you know, profited from the expertise of Philip Hobsbawm at the University in Glasgow. And both Jim and I at consecutive evening classes that I remember were, I think they were £10 a term. They were wonderful and they really kept you going. And so, you know, so there was this Glasgow little group of people, and Tom Leonard, who was really, you know, already 2 or 3 years older than me, but, you know, was writing these amazing Glasgow poems, and then incredibly pellucid, you know, scorching English poetry, you know, angry and clear and political. But over in Edinburgh, I had three good friends, Andrew Gregg, Brian McCabe and Ron Butlin, and I used to read a lot with them. And we really admired Eddie enormously. And we thought of Eddie really as being, he's about 30 years older than these little Edinburgh group. You know, I'm 72 and they're about 70-ish, you know, and we're all about that bit. And Eddie would have been 100 this year. So there's 30 years between us, but yet Eddie was just 10 years younger than Norman McCaig, who would have been 110 were he still alive. Now, he was friendly with McCaig. They were, you know, but they weren't, I don't think, influenced in any way by each other. McCaig was such a particular, it was McCaig's tone of voice. He was one of these poets with a monoglot voice. You know, it's always a McCaig voice that we're hearing, a particular stance of irony and, you know, absolute classical sort of precision as well. But although Eddie would be sometimes, you know, grouped together with them, particularly in that famous or infamous, whichever way you want to call it,
Poets
you know,
painting, poets pub,
which didn't have any women in it at all, even though I'd been going for about 10 years by that point and was getting included by these chaps who were, I must say, I've got to say, they were incredibly, all of them, they were very inclusive and welcoming and charming and encouraging, you know, to younger poets like these friends of mine. But Morgan didn't feel like a different generation to us. He felt like our big brother. I mean, much superior to us and, you know, in advance, but part of this, interested in the same kind of things as we were. American poetry and, you know, the future and, you know, he did, I mean, of course, Morgan did everything. So he did write a lot of, he did outrageous things, like he put Mayakovsky into quite a difficult Scots round about that point. You know, he would do thrawn things, Eddie would. But he was definitely very much for the future and for blank verse by and large, although wrote lots of sonnets in his life, sonnet sequences again and again. But there was a book that came out. I've got to hold it up here and now.
Wonderful.
My copy of The Second Life.
The Second Life.
The Second Life, Selected Poems of Edwin Morgan, and it's got a daisy on the front page, and it's a hardback book, and mine is signed. It's signed in some strange little writing. Eddie, you know, Edwin Morgan, Edwin Morgan, and it's Midsummer's Eve 1972. So I'd owned the book for quite a while, long enough for it to be mended with sellotape before even getting it signed by Eddie. But I'd like to read a poem from it, which describes, the book's called The Second Life. And what a pleasure it is as a woman getting to read a poem about potency in a male, you know. And so I'm going to get a chance to gender bend as I read this poem. This is The Second Life, and it was really in this particular book, which is about all kinds of things. I mean, there are poems in it. There's a poem on the death of Marilyn Monroe. There's a poem about Hemingway. There's a poem about Piaf. There's poems set all over the world. It's poems set in space. There are little experimental poems in that. Before I get to The Second Life, how about the computer's first Christmas card? And it's a little concrete poem which goes in a long line down there. So it's exactly the same amount of letters, you know, in each one. So it's a neat column. So these were kind of half concrete, half sound poems. So, you know, Jolly Mary, Holly Berry, Jolly Berry, Mary Holly, Happy Jolly, Jolly Jelly, Jelly Belly, Belly Mary, Holly Happy, Jolly Molly, Mary Jerry, Mary Harry, Hoppy Barry, Happy Jarry, Boppy Happy, Berry Jory, Jory Jolly, Moppy Jelly, Molly Mary, Jerry Jolly, Belly Boppy, Jory Hoppy, Holly Moppy, Barry Mary, Jarry Happy, Happy Boppy, Boppy Jolly, Jolly Mary, Mary Mary, Mary Mary, Merry Chris, Mary Asa, Christmas Mary, as Merry Chrysanthemum. So, you know, the computer playing around just with them. And yet Eddie never got to really like computers very much. Strangely enough, he had one, but he would have people use it in his house for him. But he had a very strange way. I was told by his great friend Tommy Smith, the saxophonist, Eddie's way with emails. A lady used to come over from Germany and go in and get all the emails for the last 2 or 3 months of Eddie's and answer them slowly by hand. You know, so that was, you know. But despite that, you know, he was very, you know, very experimental. All kinds of things were going on in this lovely hardback book, and it's a book that I take down from my shelf often and often. And here's The Second Life, the very kind of autobiographical one. He must have written that in his early 40s. And in the book, he actually dates most of the poems. So The Second Life, he actually says the date of it. The date of the computer's first Christmas card was the 22nd of December 1963, when the computer got busy on that, you know, in Eddie's own mind. But The Second Life is dated, when are we? The Second Life is dated May 1963. So Eddie would have been 43 at that point. It's always easy to work out what age he was. So he's saying The Second Life. But does every man feel like this at 40? I mean, it's like Thomas Wolfe's New York, his heady light, the stunning plunging canyons, beauty, pale stars winking hazy downtown quitting time, and the winter moon flooding the skyscrapers, northern, an aspiring place, glory of the bridges, foghorns and enormous messages, a looming mastery that lays its hand on the young man's bowels until he feels in that air, that rising spirit, All things are possible. He rises with it until he feels that he can never die. Can it be like this? And is this what it means in Glasgow now? Writing as the aircraft roar over building sites in this warm west light by the daffodil banks that were never so crowded and lavish, green May and the slow great blocks rising under yellow tower cranes, concrete and glass and steel. Out of a dour rubble it was, and barefoot children gone. It is only the slow stirring, a city's renewed life that stirs me. Could it still me so deeply as May? But could May have stirred what I feel of desire and strength, like a nun saluting the sun? All January, all February, the skaters enjoyed Bingham's Pond. The crisp, cold evenings, they swung and flashed among car headlights. The drivers parked round the unlit pond to watch them and give them light. What laughter and pleasure rose in the rare lulls of the yards away stream of wheels along Great Western Road. The ice broke up, but the boats came out. The painted boats are ready for pleasure. The long light needs no headlamps. Black ore cuts a glitter. Black ore cuts a glitter. It is heaven on earth. Is it true that we come alive not once, but many times? We are drawn back to the image of the seed in darkness, or the greying skin of the snake that hides a shining one. It will push that used up matter off. And even the film of the eye is sloughed, that the world may be the same and we are not, and so the world is not the same. The second eye is making again this place, these waters, and these towers. They are rising again as the eye stands up to the sun, as the eye salutes the sun. Many things are unspoken in the life of a man. And with a place, there is an unspoken love also in undercurrents, drifting, waiting its time. A great place, and its people are not renewed lightly. The caked layers of grime grow warm like homely coats, but yet they will be dislodged and men will still be warm. The old coats are discarded. The old ice is loosed. The old seeds are awake. Slip out of darkness. It is time. So that really is talking about the 60s and, you know, about to be the time of great change for all of us, where we thought things would never go back to what they were before. And there's little undercurrents of the hidden gay life of Eddie, which I know we've all talked about exhaustively in other places, but not being talked about there, but being hinted at by him and, you know, drifting, waiting its time. You know, so he was very much aware of all kinds of possibilities. And I love that sense of, I remember that winter. That was a winter, you know, where it snowed about December. And like round about 2010 and 2011, a couple of cold winters we had then, where it was like cities in North America, where the snow stays in the streets all over the winter. Both these winters, and it was like that in the winter of 62, 63 into the, you know, so, but written in the summer after this absolute freeze that had been going on. And of course, Bingham's Pond up there is where I've been going walks myself all during, you know, the COVID lockdown round the corner. And there are no pleasure boats on it now, but still I would imagine if we got ice this winter, there would be the skaters, you know, would be around the pond again, the crisp cold evenings. But I mean, it's so full of absolute times of a city, and comparing Glasgow to New York in so many ways.
Yes.
It's a real, you know, it's Thomas Wolfe's New York he's talking to, and that's where his imagination was going at that point, and that was the point at which all us younger poets met him, and where he joined us, he would read with us. He's, you know, he was a very reserved man. I mean, he was friendly, and he had great sense of humour, a great merry sense of humour. You know, really very, very, never unkind. He never, there was nothing harsh about. He would laugh with great enjoyment and permissiveness at people. He enjoyed people looking strange. He enjoyed, a man that looked like his dogs, or looked very unlike his dogs, or something like that, enough to nudge you in the corner and go, look. He was really, great fun. And we were all thrilled by this book. I mean, so it's a book that I'm kind of building this whole kind of talk about Eddie around this particular book, although obviously that was just him at 40, from 40 to 50, because the book came out round about the time of the moon landings and that kind of stuff. It was the end of the 60s the book came out. And then, it was 72 by the time I knew him well enough to say, could you sign my book for me, please? But, really, an absolute, an absolute strength of all Eddie's different kinds of work are in this book already. And this was him coming into his own for the first time. Before that, some of his poems had been successful and some not. And he suddenly was living away from his parents and, in a high-rise, very modernist little flat. And then what went and happened, but his auntie moved into the next tower block, his old auntie, his Aunt Myra. And he must have thought, oh God, but there you go, he kind of lived with that as well. So, he was really a character. And, he didn't discuss his private life with us, but we knew a lot about it without thinking it was in any way important, and as when I wrote a play about him once, and he says to the character Jim McGonigal, that I based on James McGonigal with James's great permission and actual help, says to Eddie in that poem, we didn't think it was important, and he said, well, it was to me, the game is so, so I mean, that was a play about how do you keep creative till the end of your life, because Eddie did. He kept writing. There was a new book of his poems came out on his 90th birthday, I remember. They were based on some really frightening dreams he'd had, and the way of stopping them from disturbing him so much was to get them to write them down as poems. So he kept creative all the way through, and this was when we were aware of God. He was really, creative. We better try and catch up with him if we could. And of course, we never could or never did, but we loved him dearly. And earlier this year, the Lost Poets were, we used to perform at the Edinburgh Festival time and things like that. I was always on buses and trains going between one place and another, but going from Glasgow over to join my Edinburgh friends. And this is round about 1977, because we were all, this little book, it's a nice wee book, there's Butlin, Greg, me and Brian McCabe in alphabetical order, and we all put a few poems we'd written at the time when we were the Lost Poets, and a few more. Every one of us put in 2 or 3 new poems that hadn't been published before, to prove that, well, we might be 70 now, but we're still doing it as well, and if we live to be 90, we hope we will do. But this one's the People's Poet, and my compadres wanted me to put it in red. Oh yes, because that just reminds us of that particular night where Eddie came and what exactly happened and what a good sport he was, So this is the People's Poet, and it says here, circa 1977. For Edwin Morgan. Under the blue moon of this whole silly business, really working for once. That is a poetry reading, but I'll start again. So under the blue moon of this whole silly business, really working for once, the People's Poet is reading to us from his most recent work. Natty in Tattersall, boyish and 50-something on the bare stage under the blue light. If the side spots have rose-coloured filters, well, that won't wash with him. Listen, his quick, light voice, not tripping ever over his own peppery rhythms, the sibilants and little silver sparks of spittle. At first it was him blinking into the black at the audience, and as wondering. At first, it was him blinking into the black at the audience, and as wondering. Had we backlit him too harshly, bungled it again? Imagine us encouraging him to leave his Antarctics and his loose leaf in the anteroom, and then him having to tiptoe through all those ladies doing yoga in Halanka, stretching breaths, just to rescue his poems. He was nice about it. Nice about the coffee we were sorry not to be able to offer in the interval and the low ticket sales. Into his second poem, he seems in his element. On the orange bucket chair behind him, his pile of hardbacks and pamphlets, that's all. The wall's aerosol labyrinth is ours. The empty bottle, painted guitar, and at his feet, somebody's rainbow scarf, a serpent straight off a snakes and ladders board. And maybe it is a game for him. Certainly there is fun in it. Didn't the 6 particle poems tickle us pink? Then there was a witch, a cat, a broomstick, a sort of story for Halloween, which it isn't, although it was while you read it. There was a mummy in need of urgent repair. Those transcripts of tapes from outer space. Yes, the woman pissing in Central Station, he wouldn't let us look away from for 1 minute. Our confusion, the celebration, Callis, Nabokov, Bolin, Presley, Lowell, of his loved, lately dead. The dance that danced them off is not what he ever praises, though who can ignore it? Outside, the buses throb and top deck passengers slide past at eye level, almost touchable. Children shout clean into the cold. The light from the public lavatory catches the hurrying moon face of one girl, and she's gone. Taxis tick on at possibly terrible cost, but the winter city won't stay locked shut. And that's what he sings out about. It's chock-a-block with life and lives we can make for. As next door, everybody doing yoga breathes towards the new me. Listen, a second life. Instructions to an actor. It's mostly resurrection he calls up in us. There is no comfort in it, except the odd moment, the ridiculous and the marvellous, speaking in tongues to the hard of hearing just for the hell of it. This poet is playing with pure sound. There is no meaning in any ordinary sense. Listen, the mad particles dance. Stanza by stanza, the poem is becoming more miraculous, more clear. We had actually scheduled that particular poetry reading for the night of a great big European football game, so it wasn't surprising that the whole city was on it. But it was interesting reading that poem as I did. I was actually back there for a moment in Hamilton Place in Edinburgh, and what was then theatre workshops premises, and Eddie there, he really was a great sport about it all, and we then said, would you like a drink? No, and he hurried for the train,
Yes.
which is very Eddie, but we all had a drink afterwards. But so I'm not sorry about reading these poems. Not that they're the greatest poems in the world, but I think they show quite a lot of influence of the influence of Eddie on us. And we really felt that Eddie was a grown-up version of our generation rather than of the previous generation of poets, much as we admired and loved them and loved spending time with them when they would give us time, as they did. They were always all very generous. So he just wrote so many different things. I love his love poems. Everybody loves. It's interesting as a heterosexual woman to be, I always loved these poems at the time. They were always to a you, and there's a couple of very different Here's One Cigarette, one of the kind of glamorous love poems that he wrote. You know, there's, if afterwards, I hope you go and look up loads more Eddie Morgan, but if you look up wonderful, you know, love poems like Strawberries and joyous love poetry. And here's One Cigarette. This is a very romantic poem, I think. No smoke without you, my fire. After you left, your cigarette glowed on in my ashtray and set up such a long thread of such quiet grey, I smiled to wonder who would believe its signal of so much love. One cigarette in the non-smoker's tray. As the last spire trembles up, a sudden draught blows it winding into my face. Is it smell? Is it taste? You are here again, and I am drunk on your tobacco lips. Out with the light. Let the smoke lie back in the dark, till I hear the very ash sigh down among the flowers of brass. I'll breathe, and long past midnight, your last kiss. There are lots of great love poems. So if you're in love, look up Eddie's great romantic love poems. But I suppose this says a lot more about my love life at the time of the 70s and 80s and so on. Well, the early 80s, before I met my wonderful husband. A poem like this, and it's so much about a kind of dialogue. I think always I'm aware that Eddie really got the spoken language alive. Yes, it was a poetic language, but it grew out of ordinary speech and the rhythms of ordinary speech. And I've always loved this poem, and it's not read a lot. It's just a poem of his that I love. It's a very dystopian love poem, I think. The Divide. I keep thinking of you, which is ridiculous. These years between us like a sea. Any dignity that came with growing older would stop my pencil on the paper. The player was open. You asked for the stones. Got that? Got steaming coffee? Conversation? The heavy curtains kept a wild night out. I keep thinking of your eyes, your hands. There is no reason for it, none at all. You would say, I can't be what I'm not, yet I can't not be what I am. Where does that leave us? What can we do? The silence after Jagger was like a cloak I'd have thrown over you. Only the wind was left, and the clock ticked as you sipped, clutching the green mug in both hands. Don't look up suddenly like that. How hard it is not to watch you. We had got to the stage of not talking and not worrying, and that was almost happy. Then late, when you lay on one elbow on the carpet, I could feel nothing but that hot knife of pain telling me what it was, and I can't tell you about it. Not one word. It's just a poem I love, and I can't explain. I don't think you should always be able to explain why you like a poem. You just love a poem, and I think that's the best thing about poetry, and the thing that makes the nonsense out of the SQA's exams and themes and things like that. What you want people to do is to find poems that they love and don't want to talk about, except to say to somebody else, listen to this.
You must read it. You must read it.
Yes, read this is what you kind of want to say. And
do you think, Liz, that his use of speech and his dialogues and his speaking and as all sorts of different people and even as objects,
animals too.
Yes, and apples too. Do you think that was an influence for you as a playwright? I know that he also loved the theatre.
He wrote,
and of course he did a wonderful translation of Cyrano de Bergerac into Scots, which is a magnificent piece. So Do you
He
think?
wrote that in 5 months.
Whoa.
I told at that time I was working a lot with Jerry Mulgrew of Communicado, and he said to me about February or something like that, I want to do Cyrano at the festival this year. I want a new version though. He said, you up for it? I said, no way. What, 5? You kidding? No way. And I said, I'll tell you what, you should ask Eddie Morgan. If he's got any sense, he'll tell you where to go. But ask him anyway. And he did. And he said, and Jerry Mulgrew tells me they got an act every month for 5 months, and then went into rehearsal with it. And that's, you know, what happened. And it's so perfect play for Eddie to translate, you know, a romantic like him. It was wonderful. I must say it was much better in that first incarnation than the recent incarnation of it, because I don't think they had worked hard enough on the language with the actors. Because Eddie's Scots, when he went into Scots, he wasn't necessarily writing a very colloquial Scots. It was a very linguistic, experimental, almost concrete kind of poetry, kind of Scots. It was like McDermott's, it borrowed from all times and places, and you know, it was really, really inventive and good fun, but it had to be grasped and made the point of, you know, a production. And I don't think that the director of that last version gave enough credence to the language that Morgan had put it into, you know, not quite enough. And it was great done as poor theatre with a whole banquet being done by Tunnock's Caramel Wafers or something like that, you know, the kind of stuff. So, I mean, Eddie liked poor theatre, as I do, because that's the kind of theatre we tended to get in Scotland, and it really made things more theatrical. I don't know, I think I always liked writing in different voices as well. You know, first of all, it would be characters, sometimes dramatic monologues, you know, from very unreliable narrators, yes. Or sometimes from split personalities within myself. You know, I'd write poems that were contradictory, but they were both from inside. But, you know, so yes, I've always liked the same kinds of things as he did. So I suppose I respond to they were just one of the many things he did. So I just really particularly like the Apple song because it's such good fun. And I think you know, he was very, very, you know, there's something camp about this Apple song. It's quite cheeky. It's kind of, it's a kind of sexy cruising poem in a way. So this Apple thing, tap me with you. So yes, this is good fun. And this is the Apple song. Tap me with your finger, rub me with your sleeve, hold me, sniff me, peel me, curling round and round till I burst out white and cold from my tight red coat and tingle in your palm as if I'd melt and breathe, a living pomander waiting for the minute of joy when you lift me to your mouth and crush me, and in taste and fragrance I race through your head in my dizzy dissolve. I sit in the bowl in my cool corner and watch you as you pass, smoothing your apron. Are you thirsty yet? My eyes are shining. It's definitely not a Granny Smith. It's definitely a shiny red Macintosh with a highlight of white, you know, in one corner as the light hits it.
You're thinking of painting it.
Yes.
I'm thinking of your evocation, which was so vivid, of a poetry reading and all that goes on around it, you know, and when you put one together in a shabby room and there's the traffic noise outside, and I'm thinking of Eddie reading under those circumstances, and yet later in his life, of course, he became the National Poet of Scotland, and he was asked to write a poem for the opening of the Scottish Parliament, or the reopening. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to read that poem for that occasion, but I know that he asked you to read it, and we've got a wonderful video of you reading it on the Edwin Morgan Trust
That was a
website.
scary gig. Can you imagine? You know, Nicola Benedetti, you know, plays her violin, and then you've got to stand up and come out with 4 minutes long, or it was more than 4 minutes, because he told me he'd been told to write a poem up to 4 minutes, and I was trying to get it down to 4 minutes. And I would rehearse in my house. My husband would listen to me. I would try and speak as quickly as Eddie, because he could really speak, you know, tongue twisters very fast. And my friend Siobhan Redmond said, you know, she would listen to me over the phone reading it, and she said, slow down, just read it to the people, let them hear it, you know. And I said, it's got to be 4 minutes long. And she said, so what are they going to do? You're on your feet, are they going to shoot you? I don't think so.
Right.
She said, you know, take your time, have fun with it. But it was full of absolute, you know, tongue twisters. And Eddie made me rehearse. I would go down to his care home, and there was a private bathroom attached to it. And you know how we all like singing in the bath, because the reverberations in a kind of cold tiled room, you know, make our voices sound good. So I'd be reading away in there, rehearsing this 4 minute long set of really, really, you know, because he was really asking a lot of the parliamentarians. He was saying, listen, you know, he was really not letting them away with anything, or nothing bland about it. But there was a wee bit of it that was just full of tongue twisters, and it was terrifying. But I didn't, you know, unlike just now when I'm talking to you over this Zoom, you know, I'm making little fluffs all the time, but something or other about that, and the fact that as I sort of stood, you know, to my feet, I turned around and just caught Sean Connery's eye as I got to my I thought, I've just got to do this and get it as right as I can for Eddie. And, you know, it was a wonderful gift for him to give me. But he knew I liked reading things out loud. And he must have also thought it would be good to have a woman doing this, you know, the politics of that and so on. And you know, although I wasn't one of the gang that got round, all the guys used to go round to Eddie's in his 70s. Yeah, from when he was about my age onwards, they did these absinthe afternoons.
Right.
Absinthe is it was called the Green Fairy, and it's a thing that it was the ruin. It was the absinthe. And Eddie wasn't a big drinker, but absinthe was the ruin of many an impressionist and post-impressionist and so on. But it was called the Green Fairy, and it was, you know, I think it was the next best. It was a sort of posh myths, I think, really. But he would buy it online. He would get it sent. I think he liked that aspect of things. The Green Fairy, the bottles of absinthe, and the Edinburgh poets, and they would come over, and they would have these absinthe afternoons. You know, they were really sort of lovely gentlemen's club little afternoons in Eddie's flat along near Annie's Land. And they've got very happy memories of it, and they've told me. And I'm not jealous, because I wouldn't have fitted into them at all. They were gentlemen's afternoons, and I'm really glad they had it. And I think, well, you let me do this instead, which was to read the. But I was going to read just a wee bit, the bit that was really hard. You know, it's the third stanza of it. He asks questions, you know. He says, what do the people want of the place? They want it to be filled with thinking persons, as open and adventurous as its architecture. A nest of fierties is what they do not want. A symposium of procrastinators is what they do not want. A phalanx of forelock tuggers is what they do not want. And perhaps, above all, the droopy mantra of it wasn't me is what they do not want. Dear friends, dear lawgivers, dear parliamentarians, you are picking up a thread of pride and self-esteem that has been almost, but not quite, or not quite, not ever broken or forgotten. When you convene, you'll be reconvening with a sense of not wholly the power, not yet wholly the power, but a good sense of what was once in the honour of your grasp. And I remember he would say to me, you're not giving enough value to the not quite, you know, not wholly the power, not yet, holy the power. He said, you're not making enough of that, not yet. You know, so he was really quite a tough director as well.
Yes, yes.
He maybe wasn't strong enough to be on his pins, you know, and stand there and deliver in that august gathering. What was for me 4.5 minutes, and I'm sure Siobhan was right. But you know, it should have made sense rather than me trying to speak as fast as Eddie Morgan. But you know, it was a real moment, and I remember later on Brian Taylor, who's become a friend. He's a big theatre fan, and I often meet him at the Lyceum on first nights in Edinburgh. And he said of it, there it is, that's the gallus moment, that's the cheeky moment. And it wasn't me, it was Edwin Morgan. You know, and it was getting to be the person who had to do him proud. And you know, it's been nice to try and do him proud and celebrate his 100th birthday, just slightly past his 100th birthday. It would have been in April, and he would have been 100. And I bet you, had he survived that long, there'd been another book out and another, you know, balloon. But you know, he lived till just not long after he was 90, and you know, creative right to the end. And when he died, it was just a couple of months after my husband had died. But I was asked if I would, you know, be fit for reading a poem at the funeral, and I said, "Oh yes." And then I said, "It's supposed to be a bit of a cheat because it's one of the longest poems, Cinque Valley," and it's one of his absolute best poems, and it's a portrait from a snapshot that he had. Once again, photography comes into it. I think an old Edwardian story about a real character called Cinque Valley, you know, and I see that I'd written my little notes for the funeral. It said, when I stood up a whole 10 years ago, and just over 10 years ago, I said, this poem was the one that Eddie said was his own favourite. So how could we not read it today? And how could we not read it this day? It's about a showman, a star of the circus and music hall. Cinque Valley is falling, falling. The shining trapeze kicks and flirts free. Solo performer at last. The sawdust puffs up with a thump, settles on a tangle of broken limbs. St. Petersburg screams and leans. His pulse flickers with the gas jets. He lives. Cinque Valley has a therapy. In his hospital bed, in his hospital chair, he holds a ball lightly, lets it roll round his hand or grips it tight, gauging its weight and resistance, begins to balance it, to feel its life attached to his by will and knowledge, invisible strings that only he can see. He throws it from hand to hand, always different, always the same, always different, always the same. His muscles learn to think. His arms grow very strong. Cinque Valley in sepia looks at me from an old postcard, bundle of enigmas. Half fawn, half military man, almond eyes, curly hair, conventional moustache, tights, and a tunic loaded with embroideries, tassels, chains, fringes. Hand on hip, with a large signet ring winking at the camera, but a bull neck and shoulders and a cannonball at his elbow as he stands by the posing pedestal, half reluctant, half truculent, half handsome, half absurd. But let me see you forget him, not to be done. Cinque Valley is a juggler. In 1,000 theatres in every continent, he is the best, the greatest. After 8 years perfecting, he can balance one billiard ball and another billiard ball on top of a cue, on top of a third billiard ball, in a wine glass held in his mouth. To those who say the balls are waxed or flattened, he patiently explains the trick will only work because the spheres are absolutely true. There is no deception in him. He is true. Cinquevalli is juggling with a bowler, a walking stick, a cigar and a coin. Who foresees how to please? The last time round, the bowler flies to his head, the stick sticks in his hand, the cigar jumps into his mouth, the coin lands on his foot, but is kicked into his eye and held there as the miraculous monocle, without which the portrait would be incomplete. Cinquevalli is practicing. He sits in his dressing room talking to some friends, at the same time writing a letter with one hand, with the other juggling 4 balls. His friends think him demons, but you could all do this, he says, sealing the letter with a billiard ball. Cinquevalli is on the high wire in Odessa. The roof cracks. He is falling into the audience. A woman breaks his fall. He cracks her like a flea, but lives. Cinquevalli broods in his armchair in Brixton Road. He reads in the paper about the shells whining at Passchendaele, imagines the mud and the dead. He goes to the window and wonders through that dark evening what is happening in Poland, where he was born. His neighbours call him a German spy. Kestner, Paul Kestner, that's his name. Keep Kestner out of the British Music Hall. He frowns. It is cold. His fingers seem stiff and old. Cinquevalli tosses up a plate of soup and twirls it on his forefinger. Not a drop spills. He laughs. And well may he laugh who can do that. The astonished table breathe again, laugh too, think the world a spinning thing that spills for a moment, no drop. Cinquevalli's coffin sways through Brixton, only a few months before the armistice. Like some trick, they cannot get off the ground. It seems to burden the shuffling bearers. All their arms cross-juggle that displaced person, that man of balance, of strength, of delights and marvels, in his unsteady box, at last into the earth.